Good afternoon, everyone. This is John Honker from Magellan Advisors. Great opportunity to speak to some of our municipal electric friends in Tennessee. And we wanted to give a shout out to TMEPA and Brian for setting this up and working with us to present this webinar on American Rescue Plan funding for broadband. Our goal today is really to help you as municipal utilities understand what opportunities are out there for funding, and especially this one, which is such what we see as a very near-term and flexible opportunity to allow munis to expand what they're doing today on broadband, or if they haven't yet, start programs that will help both their utilities and their communities respond to the issues in the pandemic and the recovery. So what we're going to do today is spend about 25 minutes on the presentation, and what we'll do is we'll use the Q&A feature, which you'll see on your Zoom toolbar at the top. If you click Q&A, you can type in a question, and that'll appear on our screens, and we'll try to get those all answered, as many as we can, being respective of your time and trying to keep the total webinar time frame to an hour. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. What we're going to work to teach to help you learn today is really what the overview of the American Rescue Plan is, and the act itself, which we call ARP or ARPA. You'll hear us use that word interchangeably. How that can be used for fiber and wireless broadband in your communities, and the breadth of opportunities that are out there, and the way that the Treasury has designed the program to be very flexible and allow communities their local choice of how to use the fund within the program, the use of funds within those program rules. Why ARPA presents a unique opportunities for municipal utilities, how to leverage ARP funds for broadband, what are some of the latest program rules and some of the final rulemaking that's coming up here in the next month or so, and then action items and next steps for muni utilities to consider as they're thinking about how to use this money for broadband and how much to allocate. Again, my name is John Honker, president of Magellan Advisors. I have worked with a number of municipal utilities in Tennessee, some of our friends at Bright Ridge and Lenore City Utilities Board, Morristown. Excited to have you guys on the call and participate. I've been in the broadband business, running Magellan for the past 18 years, and have helped over 200 municipalities, and particularly municipal utilities, develop the right plans and implement broadband networks across the country. With me, I've got Jessica Zufalo, who's the Vice President of Grants for Magellan, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. My name is Jessica Zufalo. I am thrilled to have a chance to talk to all of the municipal utilities across Tennessee. Prior to coming to Magellan, I worked for 5.5 years at the Federal Universal Service Administrative Company that administers all the federal subsidies in the government, administered, or I should say, directed by the FCC and administered by USAC. So the E-rate program, Lifeline, the RDOF program, and the high cost program and the rural healthcare program. Prior to that, I worked for 8 years as the deputy administrator for the Rural Utility Service, which is an agency within the U.S. Department of Agriculture, where I helped oversee the first round of stimulus funds from 2009 through 2012. And I came to Magellan to really help our utility and local government partners really build out networks that are sustainable using federal financing. Thank you.
Just a little bit about Magellan for those of you who don't know. Again, we work almost exclusively with munis and muni utilities, rural and urban, to help them plan, engineer, build, and operate their networks. Our goal is really to help communities thrive and bring game-changing broadband into those communities. And it takes all different kinds of forms, right? We work with munis who are building fiber backbone networks. We have heavy experience building utility and smart grid networks to support grid modernization. and to make utilities more efficient at what they do, to improve reliability and capabilities of their distribution systems, as well as, of course, a really heavy focus on fiber to the home broadband, which, of course, so many of Tennessee's municipal utilities have stepped up to the plate and are providing today. About 400 organizations or 400 municipal utilities and counties nationwide have been in business about 17 years. And our goal is really to find customized programs and the right fit for each community that is trying to tackle the broadband challenges, whatever those may be across their community. Some of our customers, again, we have heavy work with Lenore City, Morristown Utility Systems, Bright Ridge, some of your members, as well as some other significant utilities out there, such as Grucom, Gainesville Regional in Florida, Lakeland Electric. We're just finishing up a fiber to the home design for 40,000 homes across Palo Alto in California, and Glendale Water and Power in Glendale, California, as well as some of our home-based Colorado clients, City of Fort Collins and the City of Loveland, both significant municipal utilities that are just in the process of building out their fiber to the home networks today. So with that, I wanted to turn it over to Jessica to really talk about some of the ground rules around the ARPA funding and what those program rules look like.
Thank you, John. So I wanted to just start by framing today's discussion around some key data points that I think everybody on this call has probably seen in the press and elsewhere. This is really a once in a lifetime opportunity for local governments to build infrastructure. And it's all really around economic recovery to respond to the challenges that were created during the pandemic. So $350 billion that have been distributed to states, territories, tribes, counties, and munis. And that money is now available to all recipients. When I say recipients, I mean the folks that are listed on this bullet. And so the Treasury guidance really discusses recipients in that manner. $10 billion for the Coronavirus Capital Projects Fund. I'll talk a little bit about that. On May 10th, the first round of funds that are basically, think of it in two tranches. The first tranche was released May 10th. The second tranche, which is a 50% allocation, will be allocated directly to recipients, specifically counties, states, territories, and tribes and municipalities in 2022, May 10th of 2022. So 61.5 billion in direct federal aid. On May 26th, the Treasury released its funding allocations for small cities and towns, 50,000 or less. And many of those communities, the funds are flowed through the state. The reason why the Treasury did that was because they did not have really the funds control mechanism and the distribution mechanism in place to distribute it to every every small community in America. So they allowed for that distribution to happen directly through states. Really important to highlight for all of you is that broadband is indeed an eligible use criteria for funding under the interim final rule, which is the Treasury rules for how this fund, all these funds can be used. Yes, Brian, the slides will definitely be made available to all of you. And I wanted to highlight something very important, which is when you think about the project requirements, they're extremely similar to other economic development funding programs. So a lot of the USDA rural development programs and the use cases, the requirements are extremely similar. Think of it as the Treasury did not just recreate the wheel with these funds. They're very similar to EDA program dollars and requirements, as well as USDA and this community development block grant. Next slide. So the $10 billion in ARPA capital projects, this is going to be released to states and local communities sometime in July. I think about July starting now. And this is in addition to the allocation that has been distributed across the United States. So it's an additional infusion of capital for broadband projects, which we think is really exciting. that a lot of municipalities don't always think about when they're budgeting for their projects. So the statute established this fund for specifically capital construction projects around water and waste projects, and specifically broadband projects to support connectivity expansion. That's exactly lifted directly from the statute and the interim final rule. The projects can include investments that are focused in depreciable broadband infrastructure assets. So any kind of middle mile facility, any kind of last mile network assets. Some other eligible uses are connectivity infrastructure. So things like devices, modems, equipment. I would even argue that towers can be an eligible use as long as you tie it back to economic recovery. That's a theme we're going to talk about throughout this webinar, as to how to be thinking about working with your communities, working with your municipal governments around the kinds of things that Treasury is looking for. Communities to help them with telework, distance learning, and telehealth, all eligible uses. And it's all focused on how the project meets the critical connectivity needs of communities in helping them with economic recovery from the pandemic. So eligible applicants, think about a couple of key bookends around this. So, you know, as you are developing a project, a plan that would basically describe how the money, you know, is going to be used. And we'll talk about how the requirements can be used as just sort of general framing. All of these funds are very, very broadly defined. So the latitude provided to communities is extremely broad. As I said earlier, Treasury will be accepting applications. Now, there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of whether this is a program where a county or a municipality will have to actually apply. We're hearing different guidance from the National Association of Counties, but essentially it's going to be an additional infusion. And I don't think that this is going to be something where you're going to have to like compete. There's no competitive element with respect to ARP funds. Next slide. So the $10 billion will be administered in essentially two buckets. The first bucket that I discussed in the previous slide is about $5 billion of the $10 billion. The $5 billion will be for capital construction projects. And then the remaining $5 billion will be distributed along this formulaic methodology that's on this slide. So 50% of the funds will be based on the state's total population compared to the national average. So think about the density levels in Tennessee. That should give you a really good sense as to how much money will be distributed. And then 25% is based on the state's total number of rural residents. Clearly, Tennessee has a very, very large percentage of rural communities. So I think Tennessee will do really, really well with its allocation in this remaining $5 billion. And then 25% is based on the number of people who are 150% below the federal poverty guidelines. So poverty is definitely a consideration that's taken into account for this fund. Next slide. So eligible uses. There are three key eligible uses that we wanted to highlight for all of you today to really use as an area for you to be thinking about. And I hope you're thinking about how you can be utilizing these funds throughout this webinar, because we're just so excited to really have a chance to think and help you through these rules, which are sometimes a little bit dense and a little bit challenging for folks who are just administering utilities and are not thinking about the minutia of federal dollars. So one is to provide assistance to households, small businesses, nonprofits, or to aid to impacted industries. So those they've been called out specifically by the statute are areas such as tourism, travel, and hospitality. So economies that are really dependent on tourism and travel and hospitality are called out as economies and communities that are based on the tourism industry and the needs to to support them through ARPA dollars. So communities throughout all of your service territories that serve tourism, national parks, any kind of recreational businesses and services that are offered in your area. Those are areas that are really called out, that the statute is looking to help revitalize those areas economically. And then assistance, such assistance to households, businesses, and nonprofits include internet access or digital literacy. Think about how funds for under the ARPA statute can be used to really enhance broadband access to kickstart the tourism and travel industry in your area. And then funds, the second item we want to highlight is to fund government services that experienced a reduction in revenue or staff in the most recent fiscal year prior to the coronavirus emergency. So government services can include water and waste, utility services, which all of you provide, and think of things that can really help revitalize and really boost revenue. So things that would possibly provide security, redundancy, SCADA, cybersecurity to your services if they're offered, and if they're specifically municipally provisioned, which is, I think, everybody on this call, which is exciting. And then the third bullet is to make the necessary investments in water and sewer or broadband infrastructure. So what I like to think about is how to help a municipal utility weave pieces of all three into your project. And I think that's something we can really do to really make it a very, very strong, robust project that leverages the maximum amount of ARPA funds. Next slide.
Thanks, Jessica. So why municipal utilities should leverage ARP fund for broadband? So we like to cast this in a framework of opportunity cost, right? How much funding is out there for broadband and how difficult is it to get? And I think most importantly, one of the key aspects of ARPA is that it doesn't make a definitive designation between rural broadband and urban broadband. So as we look at the opportunities for municipal utilities, and we have a number of them that are actually utilizing ARPA right now for fiber and wireless build outs, including both fiber backbone and distribution. We see ARP being a funding opportunity that hasn't come around in the past. And because it's being managed by the Treasury rather than the traditional funders being FCC and RUS, the rules are different. And the rules in this case have been much more flexible in the interim final rulemaking, which our guidance is based on today. Final rules are, of course, being developed, but we're 95% there, we feel. So we look at the opportunities that this creates for municipal utilities. One is just reduce ongoing telecommunications costs and improve capabilities. So we think about this in the distribution framework, right? Electric distribution. And this funding could be potentially utilized to support those capabilities, right? Reducing your need for external telecommunications circuits if you're bringing fiber, private carrier services to your substations, and you want to provide direct fiber and fiber that you own to your substations, or to relays in the field or other grid automation projects. We see those as good opportunities, supporting the connectivity needs of your community anchors, right? So when we think about recovery, some of the major pillars are education, healthcare, public safety. So looking at how that your existing networks or building new networks could potentially add value to your local schools, bringing fiber to libraries, to hospitals and clinics, and of course to your public safety organizations. We also think about that in the framework of potentially broadband, right? In making sure that community has access to broadband, both for improving work from home capabilities and improving telehealth capabilities. Another aspect of ARP that's called out specifically is cybersecurity. So when we think about how to harden the electric grid, ARP provides funding to support reliability and security of electric distribution. So, enabling, building fiber, private fiber networks, utility-owned networks to be able to support that, keeping those SCADA and the telemetry networks completely separate from the internet networks where it's feasible, gives you a good opportunity as one of those pillars to build fiber. And finally, creating those platforms for broadband to improve both access and affordability for services. So we believe this is a very unique opportunity and a very flexible opportunity for municipal utilities to use funding. One, because this isn't a grant. ARPA is a direct entitlement to cities and counties. There's no match required. There's no application or competition for funding. It's a direct payment from the Treasury. It has low overhead compared to the traditional funding programs that you would find under RUS or FCC or any others, or for example, HUD or the EDA, which have very, very strict and stringent requirements. We've seen the Treasury's goal being to get the funding out as quickly as possible so communities can start to recover from COVID and implement that funding as quickly as possible. Because of that, the program rules allow municipal utilities to decide how the funds are used. Obviously, there's the pillars that we've talked about, but developing projects specifically for their communities and then, building those narratives around those projects to make sure that they're consistent with the ARP goals. Specific to broadband, one thing that we find very compelling is the fact that there is no debt service, right? And as many of the utilities on the phone today, you guys have built networks and are operating, or some of you are in the process. Debt service is one of those things that just becomes a challenge for some muni utilities that are building out and have to cover their costs. And ARP in this case, because it's not a loan, and there's no matching requirements, where there's technically no payback. It really is a sunk cost. The payback is in the economic benefits that come from the money. Again, many eligible expenses are covered, including planning, engineering, construction, and equipment for broadband. And then, of course, middle mile and last mile projects are allowable. So as we go on here, we like to really boil this down and talk about some practical use cases for utilities. So, over here on the left-hand side of this column, we see the ARP requirements or the pillars, and then some of those practical use cases that muni utilities or municipalities could utilize. So I mentioned improving cybersecurity already. Municipal electric utility could build its own network to connect substations, AMIs, reclosers, anything in the field that can improve the security of the grid. And also, because that item doesn't really stand on its own, also creates an opportunity for additional economic recovery, right? Because we know that if we're building out to those substations, we're passing a lot of homes and businesses on the way, and all other things as well, such as schools and hospitals, and those can all potentially be connected to not only uphold that pillar of ARP, but also other potential pillars of ARP. Healthcare institutions. So, a county or a city could expand fiber and wireless coverage to the rural and unserved households, ensuring they have access to the local providers' telehealth services, right? We all went through this during ARP and during COVID, and we all realized, hey, we've got to get on, teleconferences with our doctors now and Zoom conferences, and some people can't get that still. And we have a lot of clients, not all rural, some urban as well, that said, we're not getting enough consistent bandwidth to be able to Zoom with our healthcare providers for those telehealth sessions. So another example is communities and schools, right? How, a county or city or a municipal utility could expand fiber connectivity to schools that don't have sufficient connectivity today, and then make that available into some of your rural, your underserved, or your low-income communities to make sure they have equitable access to remote learning opportunities, right? So the goal here is it's really a two opportunities in one. One is to get those schools better connected, and then to get the student body to improve connectivity to the student body, and those families that are out and don't have good access today, either because of income gaps or because of access gaps, get them connected to either by fiber to the home or by wireless. Vaccine distribution and public health, digital literacy. So city or a county could expand the fiber and wireless coverage to community health centers, kiosks, and other facilities to address vaccine distribution, which is really COVID specific. And then emergency response, right? So the radio communications, dispatch, and wireless investments could be made to support public safety needs and ensure residents receive real-time updates about emergencies that are happening, such as what's happening with the pandemic. So these are just some direct use cases. A lot of our clients are utilizing these types of programs, but they're making them very community specific. So, one of our takeaways from today's presentation is to, build a story around your community and build a use case that addresses as many pillars as you can, because what we found in most utilities we are working with is they hit almost every one of these somehow with their fiber build outs or their wireless build outs. Jessica, back to you.
Thank you, John. So we wanted to now shift to how you can specifically leverage this, this allocation that has been distributed to your municipal governments to address the lack of affordable broadband and reliable broadband access. I want to just also stress something that my colleague John just mentioned earlier. I think we all want to leave you with a couple of things to keep in mind. One is that the ARPA statute, and specifically the Treasury guidance, permits municipal governments tremendous latitude with how this money can be used. Tremendous. So the flexibility is so broad, and it's really so unprecedented. So when people ask about this fund, how these funds, and we'll talk a little bit about this later, it's extremely broad. So first, to start with, is develop a defensible narrative. The reason why I wanted to urge you all to do that is because there are reporting requirements. They're not onerous, but we want to make sure that everybody on this call knows that to begin this process, think about a narrative, like John said, threading the needle through all these important community use cases, which are so evident in your communities. And really, the narrative needs to highlight how and demonstrate specifically how the lack of broadband has stifled economic development. That's a really broad kind of problem statement that everybody here can think about how you address that with your systems and with your goals. So, and then linking a project to some of the key objectives that have been highlighted, that John just highlighted earlier, around the economic impacts of the pandemic and how that has impacted your community. So think about like unemployment rates. Think about the level of people who have suffered from food insecurity in your area, the percentage of homelessness, the percentage of those who have passed due to the COVID pandemic. Those are the types of data points that you need. And I would say that your municipal governments, and even all of you, have this data to really weave into a narrative that'll be something that will be needed to provide to Treasury, on a fairly kind of infrequent basis. But these are the kinds of things that Treasury will want to see from you as you develop your kind of your use case for these funds. Next slide. So we wanted to highlight some things, some of the key things you need to be thinking about around your broadband strategy for ARP funds. So to start with, build political will in your communities among stakeholders. So specifically the business community, the anchor institution community, and then within the municipal system, start socializing some of these data points that we're sharing with you today. Some of them may not be aware of it, some do. But it's important for them to be aware of the unique aspects of broadband because we have spent a lot of time dissecting this and really guiding a lot of municipal utilities across the country on how they can best use these funds and be successful, demonstrating the need. Think about, developing, as I said earlier in the previous slide, your narrative. What is the need? How many people in your community don't have adequate service to be able to do telework, to be able to do distance learning, to be able to have, to start a business in their home because they don't want to drive 200 miles to a community location. And then building on existing fiber and wireless infrastructure assets. So specifically projects. So if there's any fiber project that any of you have began or started, this can be an add-on, and the ARPA statute allows you to do that. As I said earlier, wireless in many cases is used as a last mile piece to the puzzle to really meet your financial feasibility needs in a high cost area. So a fiber wireless hybrid system is certainly permissible, and these the funds can be used to augment those and to build further from them. As John said earlier, cybersecurity specifically is called out as an eligible purpose for government services funding. So think about how that can be used, how these funds can be used to harden your networks and harden your SCADA systems, because we know how important it is for security and redundancy. Enlisting support, as I said earlier, among local businesses who need connectivity and just can't really grow and build out to more customers if they don't have connectivity that's reliable. Focusing on the needs of customers who work and learn and live at home and who can't leave their home for so many reasons. And so we want to make sure that affordability is part of that discussion. The statute discusses affordability of broadband as a key piece. So we can talk about that in more detail later, but I wanted to highlight that for you. For communities that don't have affordable broadband, I would say that's a critical piece that you should be thinking about as a competitive strategy for entry. And better connectivity enables more opportunities for your customers, and that's what we want to see happening in the communities you serve in Tennessee. So really, just to close on this slide, think about a plan that kind of pieces together these keys that have been listed out in the guidance, and really think creatively how you can utilize these pieces to build your plan for ARPA funds. Next slide. So I wanted to highlight some, 4 key pieces as you're doing your internal planning for your ARP funds. So you're going to hear some reoccurring themes in each slide. Develop your business case. Think about how your use cases for broadband infrastructure, what they look like. Document them. Back them up with defensible data points that have been fleshed out already by your communities that already have it. Keep in mind, again, really important, I want everybody to highlight this, that the funds can be used in a highly flexible manner. The recent Treasury FAQs that came out on June 23rd highlight this very, very clearly, that funds can be used in a highly flexible manner, providing communities with tremendous discretion. Develop your project scope and budget. Start thinking about the costs that you have that you need met, and the costs of a project, what those costs look like, and start penciling out the pieces of that network build and what that would look like. Create the narratives that link the project again to economic losses and addressing the challenges that have been brought to your communities from the pandemic. That's so important. We can help you with this, but just think about those narratives, because Treasury really, really stresses that. And then finally, build support within your organization, getting them to think about strategically what broadband means to their area and how important it is in this pandemic. Next slide. Some of the common questions that I hear, that John and I hear a lot when we talk to municipal governments, counties, cities and municipal utilities is, gosh, I looked at the interim final rule that Treasury put out, but what we really want to do is just not in there, and we don't know if that's allowed. So there's a lot of apprehension out there, I think, in the municipal governments that we work with about how to think about ARP and whether something is permissible. And so, yes, indeed, I wanted to stress and highlight for all of you that the interim final rule contains, and this is exactly from the Treasury guidance. I did not, this is lifted right from them. It's a non-exclusive list of eligible costs. It can be funded if it addresses COVID-19 or the negative economic impacts of the pandemic. Really important. Think creatively, broadly, because it's non-exclusive, coming directly from Treasury. The interim final rule also provides flexibility to use ARPA funds for programs that are not even identified on those lists. So, feel free to think about how these projects can really meet your infrastructure goals, because this is truly a once in a lifetime opportunity. And are there restrictions on ARP funds where the Rural Digital Opportunity funding was awarded? No, and this is something that comes up a lot across the broadband landscape, which is, well, if the RDOF program provisionally funded certain areas, does that mean that my ARP funds cannot be used there? I would say absolutely not. There is no at all any language from Treasury that indicates that those funds that were funded under RDOF cancel out and prohibit ARP from being used in that area. ARP funds and ARP funded projects can actually overlap with RDOF projects, and networks that are funded by ARP will likely be in progress. So this is an important point that I'm highlighting here. Very important point. When we talk to communities, they say, gosh, we're hearing that, co-op is going to be building out in this area, or a cable operator is going to be building out because of RDOF. I want to stress a couple of things about RDOF. Number one, it has not, none of the RDOF applicants have been awarded. Nothing has been awarded at all. Okay, so that's a very important point to think about. And whoever builds out in the area first is really the one that has the control over the customer. So do not feel at all apprehensive about the expectation that RDOF is coming, because it's still very much an open question as to where that money and how that money is distributed, and whether that long form application that's been filed by the cooperative or any entity actually gets approved. So next slide. The key dates. So the Treasury portal is open. Many of you know that, but for those who have not submitted their credentialing to the Treasury portal, you must do so to basically disperse and draw from the funds that are available to you. August 31st is the deadline for counties and local governments to submit their first interim report. So as your communities are thinking about broadband infrastructure, any infrastructure expenditure, those narratives come into play August 31st. October 31st is the deadline to submit your first quarterly project and expenditure report. So that's where some more detail on how the funds, the actual expenditure of ARP funds are going to be submitted to Treasury. And then December 31st of 2024 is when funds must be incurred and obligated. And what's exciting about ARP is that, unlike CARES money, you have up until 2026 for funds to be expended. So the period of performance runs through 2026 for your projects, where all work must be completed by then. And what I'd like to do is just print this out, put it in front or somewhere close to you, so you kind of know these key dates, and remind your local leaders, like, do you need data? This is, an important deadline coming up in 2 months. And I would really urge all of you to be thinking about, discussing your potential needs for projects with your counterparts at in city government and municipal governments, so that you can weave your narratives in by the 31st of August. Next slide.
Great, thank you, Jessica. And I think one thing to leave on and before we jump into the question period is, you guys have all probably heard about ARP to some degree and the funding that's out there, and every city, of course, is getting it. When we think about the funding, there's opportunity cost on the funding, right? Meaning that there's different municipal departments that are going to be looking to allocate it, whether it's water, for sewer, for economic development. So, as you think about whether you could use this money for broadband, you'll have competing interests within each city, right? That's a given, and that's always the way it is with budgets, right? But I think some of the really important aspects to think about and why this is such a rare opportunity for municipal utilities is, unlike water and sewer and other major infrastructure projects like that, they have well-established funding programs that cities can use every day to go after money to make those improvements. It's hard to do it in the broadband world. It's much more difficult. Looking at the way that, the process that some of you have used to go move through the planning and the implementation and the funding and the structuring of those funds to build, fiber to the home and wireless networks, what it takes, how hard it is. And the funding is a big part of that. So when we look at this, we see it as a much more flexible and an easier opportunity for municipal utilities to use for broadband. And when we look at the opportunity cost involved in that, right, meaning the other avenues that the money could be used for, it really creates the best use case. Broadband creates the best use case out of everything that we see today. And with that, we've got a couple of minutes left, so I wanted to answer a couple of questions that we have on from members of TMEPA. The first question was, would distribution automation investments qualify? The idea being that improved reliability enhances economic resiliency. And from the ARP guidance that we've seen in the interim final rule, we definitely believe distribution automation would qualify, and that you could you could build a narrative around how reliability improves the economy, right? Especially in potentially attracting and retaining existing jobs with reliable power. So we would see that as a direct link between, what you need in the local community as far as fortifying your distribution plant and upholding the ARP guidelines. We did have one other question. Due to our state law prohibition of municipal utilities providing broadband in Mississippi, so coming a little bit outside of the Tennessee realm, but one of the ideas around that is that the municipal utility would build and own the fiber and lease it to another entity to provide service to the end user. Could ARPA funding be used in this model? Again, we think it could. Look at your use case for building the network in those areas. Look for underserved and unserved customers predominantly. Look at affordability issues in the community, and also look at really the reliability of service that residents and businesses are getting. We didn't see anything in the existing interim final rules that would prohibit a sort of a partnership with another entity to provide services to the end user. No guidance on that at all. So, based on the sort of flexibility built into the ARPA rules, we believe that would be allowable. But if we see any specific guidance, we're happy to update the membership. We have one more question coming through. Actually, two.
So John, there's one question I just wanted to answer from someone anonymously asked. So if we apply for money, are we taking money away from other city departments? So in terms of city departments, I don't know. I know that your city is allocated a very specific amount directly to your city and directly to your county. And so it's up to the city to determine how they want to distribute the funds. But if, you know, in the event of those on this call who understand and are in the utility and distribution business every day, you know, this is probably the best time for you to make your case, because the interim final rule and the ARPA statute specifically calls out broadband. So if you were ever thinking of utilizing or drawing from funds, this is truly, in my opinion, having been involved in the federal funding space for many, many years, it's the best source of funds. As John said, there's no match required here, and it's a direct allocation, and it's the broadest possible use and eligibility I have ever seen. Thanks.
Okay, we've got one more question. This is actually a two-part question. So the question is, in the event that the utility is not part of the municipality that received funding, right, which is it, do you see a requirement for an RFP process to provide opportunities for competing private ISPs to have an opportunity as well? So this is a two-part question. So I'm going to answer that first part by, so the question is basically saying, if the receiving entity is not part of the municipality that's receiving funding, would there need to be an RFP process by the municipality to provide opportunities for competing ISPs to also potentially participate in that funding? I think that is a municipal procurement issue more so than it is an ARPA issue. So I think from the ARPA standpoint, we would look at that and say, look, in this case, let's say the city is making the investments in the infrastructure itself. ARPA does not have any rulemaking that says there has to be a competitive process in selecting a provider to deliver services over that network. So I think we would defer then to the city procurement rules around how they wanted to procure the services for that, to procure the services of an ISP to operate on that network. The second part of that question was also, would you expect that the municipality should require a grant type setup with matching to distribute to utilities and others? I think, again, you know, we don't see that written into the rulemaking for ARPA, but so it would more than likely be a preference of the municipality of how it wanted to utilize those funds. So, for example, let's say, you know, city has $5 million or $10 million for a potential fiber to the home build, and the question is whether the city would ask for a match for a portion of that. And I think that's really up to the local government's preference on whether they would just fund that entire infrastructure, or they would provide a a match incentive, which would keep the potential service provider more bound to the city and have skin in the game, let's say. So that was a two-part question. Hope there was clarity on that. Okay, well, that is all the questions that have been received so far. Are there any other questions? If so, just please submit them via the Q&A feature in Zoom, and we'll just give everyone a minute before we close. Okay, we did get one more question in. If our utility expands across multiple counties, would we have to reach out to each county for funds specific to that location? The question would be, the answer would be yes to that question. So for example, if you've got your utility, if you've got electric meters across 2 counties, then you would want to be reaching out to each county where you have a plant and you have customers and talking to them individually about ARPA funds and potentially partnering with them to build broadband. So our understanding at this point is that, any funds that would be received by a county would be for investments made in that county. So you wouldn't want to take funds allocated to one county and put them into another county. That probably would not be consistent with the rulemaking or the politics in each of those counties. Great question.
Yeah, and I just want to add, if anyone has specific, questions when we're done with this today's session, we can answer, because these are pretty specific questions that that are really good, that we hear about from a lot of different municipal utilities. So thanks for getting them over to us.
Yep, absolutely. We're always here to help our municipal utility customers, make the right decisions for building out their broadband networks. So we're excited to have ARP as a funding platform that's out there. We're seeing it being utilized. It's out there today and it's in real time. So funds are being drawn and utilities are using it. And if we can be of any assistance, please contact us. We'll follow up this presentation with an email and a link to download the webinar and the information in the webinar. And then please reach out to us if you have any questions. Jessica, myself, and the rest of the Magellan team are here to answer any questions that you have as you navigate this potential opportunity for funding broadband.